Hey everyone! This evening, we'll be exploring the fascinating subject of primitive attire. Without further ado, let's begin our story. The story of human clothing begins not in grand halls or bustling marketplaces, but in the quiet moments of our earliest ancestors discovering that the world around them held both danger and opportunity, that their bodies, while remarkably adapted to so many tasks, needed protection from the elements that could be harsh and unforgiving. Picture, if you will, a time so distant that the very landscape would seem alien to our modern eyes, when massive glaciers carved valleys and the air carried a different quality, crisp and wild. And in this world, our ancestors moved with a purpose that was both simple and profound, the purpose of survival, of finding warmth when the cold winds blew, of shielding their skin from the burning sun, of protecting themselves from thorns and rough surfaces as they moved through their daily lives. The first clothing wasn't clothing as we think of it today, not woven or sewn or designed, but rather the simple act of draping an animal hide over shoulders that shivered in the cold. A discovery that must have seemed revolutionary in its time, though it happened not in a single moment of inspiration, but through countless small observations and experiments across generations. These early humans, with their keen intelligence and observational skills, noticed how the fur of animals kept those creatures warm, how the thick hides protected them from injury, and slowly, incrementally, they began to understand that what worked for animals could work for them too. The process of creating these first garments was laborious and required innovation at every step. From the hunting of large animals to the careful removal of their skins, from the cleaning and preparation of these hides to the eventual wearing of them as protective coverings. In caves across Europe, Asia, and Africa, evidence tells us stories of these early clothing makers, though the garments themselves have long since returned to dust, leaving only the tools behind, the scrapers and awls and needles that speak of careful hands working leather into wearable forms. These bone needles, some dating back 40,000 years or more, are marvels of engineering when you consider them closely. Carved with stone tools from mammoth ivory or bird bones, polished smooth through use, their eyes carefully drilled to allow sinew or plant fibers to pass through. Each needle represents hours of work, days even, and the fact that our ancestors invested such time in creating these tools tells us how important clothing had become to their survival, and perhaps even to their sense of identity. The wearing of animal skins evolved differently in different regions, shaped by the local climate and the animals available for hunting. In the frozen expanses of Ice Age Europe, the heavy furs of mammoths, bears, and wolves provided essential warmth, while in more temperate regions, the lighter skins of deer and antelope sufficed. The preparation of these hides was an art form in itself, requiring knowledge passed down through generations about how to remove the fur when desired, how to tan the leather to prevent decay, how to soften it for comfort against the skin. Women and men alike participated in these processes, though in many societies, certain tasks became specialized, with some individuals becoming known for their particular skill in working hides or creating especially fine garments. The techniques they developed were ingenious in their simplicity and effectiveness. They discovered that brains, when rubbed into hide, would help preserve and soften it. That smoke could cure leather and make it more resistant to water. That urine could help in the tanning process, breaking down the proteins in ways that made the hide more pliable. These might seem crude methods to our modern sensibilities, but they represented sophisticated chemical processes that our ancestors understood through trial and error, through observation and repetition. The knowledge of these techniques became precious cultural capital, shared within groups and taught to children who would carry these skills forward into the next generation. As humanity spread across the globe, clothing adapted to meet the challenges of new environments. In the Arctic regions, the Inuit and other peoples developed complex layered clothing systems that provided insulation through trapped air, using the fur of caribou with its hollow hairs that provided exceptional warmth for its weight, creating parkas with hoods lined with wolverine fur that wouldn't frost from breath, designing boots that could keep feet warm even in the most extreme cold. These weren't simple animal skins draped over the body, but carefully constructed garments with specific cuts and seams, with different materials used for different parts of the garment based on their properties. The inner layer might be worn with the fur against the skin for maximum warmth, while the outer layer had the fur facing outward to shed snow and wind. Meanwhile, in tropical regions where cold was never a concern, early peoples developed different solutions to their clothing needs. Here, protection from the sun and from insects became paramount, along with cultural and social considerations that made clothing about more than just physical protection. They discovered that certain plant fibers could be beaten and woven into cloth-like materials, that bark could be processed into a soft, pliable fabric, that grasses and leaves could be woven into coverings that provided shade and allowed air to circulate, keeping the body cool even in intense heat. The tapa cloth of the Pacific Islands, made from the inner bark of certain trees, beaten thin and often decorated with natural dyes, represents one of humanity's earliest ventures into creating clothing from plant materials rather than animal hides. The transition from hide to plant-based clothing materials was gradual and happened at different times in different places, often running parallel as people used whatever materials were most readily available and suitable for their needs. The discovery that certain plants contained long, strong fibers that could be separated from the rest of the plant material was revolutionary. Flax, one of the earliest plant fibers to be used for clothing, was being cultivated and processed into linen in ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia thousands of years ago. The process of retting, where flax stems were soaked in water to separate the fibers from the woody parts of the plant, then dried, beaten, and combed before being spun into thread, required patience and skill. But the resulting fabric was cool, comfortable, and could be woven into various weights suitable for different purposes. The invention of spinning and weaving transformed clothing from something that followed the natural shape of animal hides to something that could be constructed in any shape or size desired. The spindle, a simple tool consisting of a shaft and a weight, allowed fibers to be twisted together into strong threads, while the loom, even in its most primitive form of stakes driven into the ground with threads stretched between them, allowed these threads to be woven into fabric. These technologies didn't appear overnight, but developed over millennia, with each innovation building on the last, each culture adding its own refinements and techniques. In many primitive societies, the creation of clothing became deeply intertwined with spiritual and cultural practices. The patterns woven into fabric or painted onto leather weren't merely decorative but carried meaning, telling stories of the wearer's ancestry, achievements, or spiritual beliefs. Colors held significance too, with certain dyes being reserved for specific occasions or social ranks. The process of creating these dyes from plants, minerals, and even insects was another area where primitive peoples showed remarkable ingenuity. The deep purple from murex snails, the brilliant red from cochineal insects, the rich blues from indigo plants, each required specific knowledge about harvesting, processing, and application that could take years to master. The social implications of clothing in primitive societies were profound and complex. While we might imagine early humans as being unconcerned with fashion or appearance, the evidence suggests otherwise. Even in the earliest societies, clothing served to distinguish between different groups, to mark important life transitions, to display wealth or skill or spiritual power. A hunter who had killed a particularly dangerous or prestigious animal might wear its skin or teeth as a mark of prowess. A shaman or spiritual leader might wear specific garments during ceremonies that were believed to help them communicate with the spirit world. Young people reaching adulthood might receive special garments that marked their new status in society. The gendered aspects of primitive clothing varied enormously between cultures, but in many societies, distinct differences emerged in what men and women wore, not just in terms of style, but in terms of the materials used and the methods of construction. These differences often reflected the different roles that men and women played in society, but they also served to reinforce and perpetuate these roles. In some cultures, women were the primary creators of clothing, spending countless hours spinning, weaving, and sewing, their skill in these areas being as valued as men's skill in hunting or warfare. In other cultures, certain types of clothing production were exclusively male activities, particularly those involving leatherworking or the creation of ceremonial garments. Children's clothing in primitive societies tells us much about how these cultures viewed childhood and the process of growing up. In many cases, young children wore little or no clothing, especially in warm climates, but as they grew older, they would begin to wear garments that increasingly resembled adult clothing, marking their gradual transition into full membership in society. The creation of children's clothing, often from the worn-out garments of adults, required its own set of skills, as the clothing needed to allow for growth while still providing adequate protection. Special garments might be created for important ceremonies in a child's life, such as naming ceremonies or coming-of-age rituals, and these garments often incorporated protective symbols or materials believed to ward off evil spirits or bring good fortune. The seasonal nature of clothing in many primitive societies reflected a sophisticated understanding of how to adapt to changing conditions throughout the year. Summer garments were designed to protect from the sun while allowing maximum air circulation, often incorporating loose weaves or strategic ventilation. Winter garments were layered, with each layer serving a specific purpose: trap air for insulation, block wind, shed water, or provide comfort against the skin. The transition between seasons required careful planning and preparation, with garments being repaired, waterproofed, or modified as needed. Storage of off-season clothing required its own set of techniques to prevent damage from insects, rodents, or moisture, often involving specific herbs or preparation methods that had been proven effective over generations. The decorative elements of primitive clothing deserve special attention, as they represent some of humanity's earliest artistic expressions. Long before written language, people were using clothing as a canvas for creative expression, incorporating patterns, colors, and textures that pleased the eye and carried cultural meaning. Beads made from shells, seeds, bones, and stones were sewn onto garments in intricate patterns that might take months to complete. Feathers from birds were incorporated, not just for their beauty, but for their symbolic significance, with different birds representing different qualities or powers. Fringes served both decorative and practical purposes, helping to shed rain while also creating movement and visual interest. The trade networks that developed around clothing materials and finished garments were among humanity's earliest forms of long-distance commerce. Shells from coastal areas would find their way hundreds of miles inland to be used as decoration on clothing. Particularly fine furs from northern regions would be traded for plant fibers or dyes from southern areas. The knowledge of specific techniques or patterns would spread along these trade routes, leading to a cross-pollination of ideas and methods that enriched the clothing traditions of all involved. These trade relationships often became formalized into regular exchange systems, with certain groups specializing in the production of particular types of garments or materials that were highly valued by others. The tools used in clothing production evolved alongside the garments themselves, each innovation making possible new techniques or improving the efficiency of existing ones. From the simple bone needle to the complex heddle loom, from the basic spindle to the spinning wheel, each advancement represented countless hours of experimentation and refinement. The creation and maintenance of these tools was itself a specialized skill, with tool makers being valued members of society whose work enabled everyone else to have adequate clothing. The passing down of tools from one generation to the next was often accompanied by the passing down of knowledge about how to use them effectively, creating chains of learning that stretched back through time. The waterproofing of clothing was a particular challenge that primitive peoples solved in various ingenious ways. In coastal areas, seal or walrus intestines were carefully cleaned and sewn together to create waterproof parkas that could keep the wearer dry, even in driving rain or when splashed by waves. The application of animal fats or plant oils to leather or fabric could provide water resistance, though this treatment needed to be renewed regularly. Some cultures discovered that certain plant resins or latex could be applied to fabric to create a waterproof coating, leading to the development of early rain gear that was both functional and durable. The knowledge of which materials and methods worked best in different conditions was crucial for survival, particularly for peoples who lived in areas with extreme weather. Footwear represents a special category of primitive clothing, requiring different materials and construction techniques than body garments. The protection of feet was essential for traveling over rough terrain, yet footwear needed to be flexible enough to allow for natural movement and sensitive enough to provide feedback about the ground underfoot. Moccasins made from soft leather, sandals woven from plant fibers, boots constructed from multiple layers of hide and fur. Each style reflected the specific needs and available materials of the culture that created them. The decoration of footwear was often as elaborate as that of other garments, with beadwork, quillwork, or painted designs that might indicate the wearer's status, achievements, or tribal affiliation. The repair and maintenance of clothing was an ongoing concern in primitive societies, where the creation of new garments required such significant investment of time and resources. Techniques for patching tears, reinforcing wear points, and refreshing water resistance were essential skills that everyone needed to possess to some degree. The concept of making do and extending the life of garments as long as possible led to creative solutions, with worn-out adult clothing being repurposed for children, damaged garments being taken apart and the good portions reused, and decorative elements being transferred from one garment to another as needed. This approach to clothing as a valuable resource that needed to be carefully maintained influenced many aspects of daily life and social organization. Head coverings served multiple purposes in primitive societies, from protection against sun and cold to indicators of social status or religious significance. The variety of head coverings developed by different cultures is remarkable, from simple bands of leather or cloth to elaborate headdresses incorporating feathers, bones, shells, and other materials. In many cultures, specific head coverings were reserved for certain individuals or occasions, with unauthorized wearing being a serious social transgression. The construction of these head coverings often required specialized skills and materials, with some taking months or even years to complete. The symbolism embedded in head coverings could be complex and multi-layered, with different elements representing different aspects of the wearer's identity or role in society. The relationship between clothing and climate adaptation goes beyond simple protection from the elements. Primitive peoples developed sophisticated understanding of how clothing could be used to regulate body temperature through various mechanisms. They discovered that multiple thin layers provided better insulation than a single thick layer, that certain weaves or knits created air pockets that enhanced warmth, that the color of clothing affected heat absorption and reflection. In hot climates, they learned that loose flowing garments created convection currents that helped cool the body, while in cold climates, tight-fitting underlayers reduced heat loss while outer layers blocked wind. This knowledge was often encoded in cultural practices and traditions that ensured each generation understood how to dress appropriately for their environment. The use of animal parts in clothing went far beyond simple hides and furs. Bones were carved into buttons, toggles, and decorative elements. Sinew was used as thread for sewing, being stronger and more durable than plant fibers for certain applications. Bladders and intestines were used for waterproof containers and clothing elements. Antlers and horns were fashioned into tools for working leather or incorporated into ceremonial garments. Teeth and claws became decorative elements that also served as symbols of the wearer's hunting prowess or spiritual power. Even animal brains, as mentioned earlier, played a crucial role in the tanning process. This complete utilization of hunted animals reflected both practical necessity and spiritual beliefs about honoring the animals that gave their lives for human survival. The development of textile patterns and designs in primitive societies often followed mathematical principles that the creators might not have consciously understood but applied intuitively. Geometric patterns based on symmetry, repetition, and variation appeared independently in cultures around the world, suggesting something fundamental about human aesthetic preferences and cognitive processing. These patterns weren't merely decorative, but often served practical purposes as well, with certain weaves or knits providing greater strength, flexibility, or insulation than others. The ability to visualize and execute complex patterns was a highly valued skill, with master weavers and designers holding important positions in society. The role of clothing in primitive religious and spiritual practices cannot be overstated. Shamans and spiritual leaders often wore specific garments, believed to help them travel between worlds or communicate with spirits. These garments might incorporate materials believed to have special powers, such as certain feathers, stones, or plant materials. The creation of these ceremonial garments was often surrounded by rituals and taboos, with specific rules about who could make them, when they could be made, and how they should be treated. The wearing of these garments was typically restricted to specific ceremonies or individuals, with severe consequences for unauthorized use. The designs and decorations on these garments often represented cosmological beliefs, creation stories, or spiritual journeys, serving as visual texts that could be read by those who understood their symbolism. The influence of clothing on social stratification in primitive societies was significant and complex. While we might imagine early societies as being relatively egalitarian, the evidence suggests that distinctions in clothing often reflected and reinforced social hierarchies. Leaders might wear garments made from rarer materials or decorated with more elaborate designs. Successful hunters or warriors might have the right to wear certain types of furs or decorations that others could not. Skilled craftspeople might wear clothing that displayed their expertise, serving as a form of advertisement for their services. These distinctions weren't merely about display, but often had practical implications, with certain types of clothing providing access to specific social spaces or activities. The gendered division of labor in clothing production varied significantly between cultures, but often reflected broader patterns of social organization. In many societies, women were responsible for the production of plant-based textiles, from the cultivation of fiber plants to the spinning and weaving of cloth. Men might be more involved in hunting and leather preparation, though there were many exceptions to these patterns. The knowledge and skills required for different aspects of clothing production were often closely guarded secrets, passed down within families or specialized groups. This specialization led to the development of distinct traditions and techniques that became markers of cultural identity. The portability of clothing and clothing-making tools was crucial for nomadic peoples, influencing both the types of garments they created and the methods they used. Clothing needed to be easily packed and transported, leading to designs that could be rolled or folded compactly. Tools needed to be lightweight yet durable, often serving multiple purposes. The techniques used for creating clothing in nomadic societies often differed from those used by sedentary peoples, with an emphasis on methods that could be practiced while on the move or during brief stops. This mobility also influenced the types of decorations used, with a preference for attached rather than separate ornaments that might be lost during travel. The acoustic properties of clothing might seem like an odd consideration, but for primitive peoples, the sounds made by clothing could be significant. Hunters needed clothing that allowed them to move silently through forests or across plains. Dancers and ceremonial participants might wear clothing designed to create specific sounds, with shells, bells, or other noisemakers attached to enhance the auditory experience of rituals. The rustle of certain materials or the click of decorative elements could serve as a form of nonverbal communication, alerting others to someone's approach or status. This attention to the sonic qualities of clothing reflects a more holistic understanding of how garments functioned in daily and ceremonial life. The preservation of clothing in primitive societies required different strategies than those we use today. Without modern moth-proofing or climate control, keeping clothing in good condition required constant vigilance and specific techniques. Certain plants were known to repel insects and were placed with stored garments. Clothing might be regularly aired and beaten to remove dust and pests. Special storage containers made from bark, basketry, or hide were developed to protect valuable garments. The seasonal nature of some clothing meant that proper storage was essential for ensuring garments would be usable when needed again. These preservation techniques were often as important as the creation techniques themselves, requiring their own body of knowledge and skill. The exchange of clothing as gifts or tribute played important roles in diplomacy and social relationships between different groups. A finely made garment could serve as a peace offering, a wedding gift, or a sign of alliance. The giving and receiving of clothing created social bonds and obligations that extended beyond the immediate transaction. In some cultures, specific garments were created solely for gift giving, never to be worn by their makers, but instead to demonstrate skill and generate prestige. These gift garments often incorporated the finest materials and most elaborate decorations available, representing significant investments of time and resources. The protocols around such exchanges were often complex, with rules about what could be given to whom and under what circumstances. The adaptation of clothing for specific occupations or activities showed remarkable innovation and practical problem solving. Hunters developed clothing that provided camouflage, breaking up the human outline and helping them blend into their surroundings. Fishers created garments that could withstand constant exposure to water and salt. Gatherers designed clothing with built-in carrying capacity, incorporating pockets, pouches, or attachment points for baskets. Warriors developed clothing that provided some protection in combat while still allowing freedom of movement. These occupational garments evolved through trial and error, with successful innovations being adopted and refined over time. The specific requirements of different activities led to specialized knowledge about materials and construction techniques that might be closely guarded professional secrets. The role of color in primitive clothing extended far beyond mere aesthetics. Colors carried meanings that could vary dramatically between cultures, with the same color representing good fortune in one society and death in another. The creation of dyes from natural sources required extensive knowledge about plants, minerals, and chemical processes. Some colors were easy to achieve and therefore common, while others required rare materials or complex processes, making them symbols of wealth or status. The application of color to clothing through dyeing, painting, or the incorporation of naturally colored materials was often surrounded by ritual and meaning. The fading or changing of colors over time might be seen as significant, with garments gaining or losing power as their colors altered. The insulation properties of different materials were understood through practical experience long before the science of thermodynamics was developed. Primitive peoples knew that fur with hollow hairs provided better insulation than solid hairs, that down feathers trapped air more effectively than flight feathers, that certain plant fibers retained warmth even when wet, while others lost all insulation value. This knowledge influenced not just the choice of materials, but also how they were processed and incorporated into garments. The layering systems developed by various cultures showed sophisticated understanding of how to create effective insulation while maintaining flexibility and breathability. The positioning of different materials within a garment, with wind-resistant materials on the outside and insulating materials on the inside, demonstrated practical engineering skills developed through generations of experience. The concept of modesty and appropriate coverage varied enormously between primitive societies, influenced by climate, available materials, and cultural beliefs. What was considered necessary coverage in one society might be seen as excessive or insufficient in another. These standards often varied by age, gender, social status, and occasion, with different rules applying in different contexts. The enforcement of clothing norms could range from gentle social pressure to severe punishment for violations. Children were taught from an early age what was considered appropriate dress, with these lessons being reinforced through story, example, and sometimes ritual. The relationship between clothing and modesty wasn't always about covering the body, but could involve specific ways of wearing garments, certain colors or decorations, or the absence of particular elements. The recycling and repurposing of clothing materials was a fundamental aspect of primitive clothing systems. Nothing was wasted if it could be avoided, with worn-out garments being transformed into new items through creative reuse. Old leather might be cut into strips for lacing or binding. Worn fabric might be unraveled and the threads rewoven into new cloth. Decorative elements would be carefully removed from garments that were beyond repair and applied to new pieces. This approach to clothing as a valuable resource that needed to be carefully maintained influenced design decisions, with garments sometimes being constructed in ways that made disassembly and reuse easier. The knowledge of how to effectively repurpose materials was an important skill, often passed down through families along with collections of saved materials waiting for new life. The seasonal ceremonies and rituals around clothing production and wear were important cultural events in many primitive societies. The first wearing of winter clothes might be marked by ceremony, as might the packing away of these clothes in spring. The completion of a particularly fine garment might be celebrated with feasting and display. Certain times of year might be designated for specific clothing-related activities, such as the gathering of dye plants, the shearing of animals, or the communal production of textiles. These ceremonies serve not just to mark the practical aspects of clothing production, but to reinforce cultural values, transmit knowledge, and strengthen social bonds. The stories told during these gatherings often contained practical information about clothing embedded in mythological or historical narratives. The protective functions of clothing went beyond physical protection to include spiritual and psychological protection. Many primitive peoples believed that clothing could protect against evil spirits, bad luck, or the malevolent intentions of others. Specific materials, colors, or designs might be believed to have protective properties, leading to their incorporation into everyday and ceremonial garments. Amulets and talismans were often sewn into clothing or worn as part of clothing ensembles. The belief in the protective power of clothing influenced many aspects of daily life, from the clothes worn by pregnant women to protect their unborn children to the garments placed on the deceased for their journey to the afterlife. These beliefs weren't uniform but varied widely between cultures, with each developing its own complex system of clothing-related spiritual practices. The communication aspects of clothing in primitive societies functioned as a complex nonverbal language that could convey information about the wearer's identity, intentions, and state of mind. A warrior might wear different clothing when seeking peace than when preparing for battle. A woman might signal her availability for marriage through specific garments or decorations. Mourning clothes indicated not just grief, but also the social expectations and restrictions placed on the bereaved. This clothing language needed to be learned and understood by all members of society to function effectively, with misreadings potentially leading to serious social consequences. The ability to correctly interpret clothing signals was an important social skill, while the ability to effectively use clothing for communication could provide significant advantages in social, economic, and political interactions. The influence of dreams and visions on clothing design and decoration was significant in many primitive cultures. Shamans and spiritual leaders might receive instructions in dreams about how to create certain garments or what materials to use. Individuals might have visions that led them to incorporate specific symbols or designs into their clothing. These spiritually inspired garments were often believed to have special powers or significance, being worn only for specific purposes or by particular individuals. The process of creating such garments might involve fasting, meditation, or other spiritual practices to ensure that the finished product properly embodied the vision or dream. The interpretation of these visions and their translation into physical garments required specialized knowledge that bridged the practical and spiritual realms. The acoustic design of ceremonial clothing deserves special attention for its sophistication and intentionality. Dancers' garments might incorporate hundreds of small shells, bones, or metal pieces positioned to create specific rhythms and tones as the wearer moved. The materials chosen and their placement were at random but carefully planned to achieve desired sonic effects. Some garments were designed to be nearly silent during certain movements, but to create sound during others, allowing dancers to control the acoustic dimension of their performance. The creation of these sound-producing garments required not just craft skills, but also musical knowledge and an understanding of how different materials and constructions would behave during movement. The wearing of such garments was often restricted to trained performers who knew how to properly activate their sonic potential. The relationship between clothing and body modification practices such as tattooing, scarification, and piercing was complex and varied between cultures. In some societies, clothing was designed to display body modifications with strategic cutouts or transparent sections. In others, clothing might hide modifications except during specific ceremonies or among certain groups. The interaction between permanent body decoration and temporary clothing. Decoration created layered systems of meaning and display. Some garments were specifically designed to complement particular body modifications, while others might temporarily replace them for those who hadn't yet undergone or couldn't undergo the permanent procedures. This interplay between body and clothing decoration influenced both practices, with innovations in one area often leading to changes in the other. The mathematical precision required in creating fitted garments without modern measuring tools demonstrates remarkable spatial reasoning abilities. Primitive peoples developed various methods for ensuring proper fit, from using body parts as measuring units to creating templates from bark or hide. The ability to visualize how flat pieces of material would conform to the three-dimensional human body when assembled required sophisticated understanding of geometry, even if not expressed in formal mathematical terms. Different cultures developed different solutions to the challenge of creating fitted garments, from the wrapped and draped styles that required no cutting to complex multi-piece constructions that closely followed body contours. The knowledge of how to achieve proper fit was often closely guarded, with master garment makers being highly valued for their ability to create clothing that was both functional and flattering. The durability of primitive clothing was achieved through various means, from the selection of naturally robust materials to techniques for reinforcing high-wear areas. Double-layered knees and elbows, reinforced seams using special stitching patterns, the strategic placement of harder-wearing materials at stress points, all demonstrated understanding of how garments wore out and how to prevent or delay this process. The balance between durability and other desired qualities such as flexibility, breathability, or appearance required careful consideration and often clever solutions. Some cultures developed garments with replaceable sections, allowing worn parts to be replaced without discarding the entire garment. This modular approach to clothing construction influenced design decisions and required standardization of certain measurements and attachment methods. The transportation of trade goods related to clothing shaped early economic systems and cultural exchanges. Caravans carrying precious dyes, fine fabrics, or exotic furs traveled vast distances, facing dangers from weather, terrain, and human threats. The value-to-weight ratio of clothing materials made them ideal trade goods, with a small bundle of high-quality fabric or rare furs potentially worth more than much larger quantities of other goods. The knowledge of trade routes, seasonal patterns, and market preferences became valuable expertise, with successful traders gaining wealth and influence. The spread of clothing styles, materials, and techniques along these trade routes led to cultural fusion and innovation, with new hybrid styles emerging at cultural crossroads. These trade networks also spread technological innovations, with new tools, techniques, or materials rapidly disseminating across vast distances once their value was recognized. The role of clothing and rites of passage marked important transitions in individual lives and reinforced cultural values about growth, responsibility, and social position. A young person's first adult garment might be created with great ceremony, incorporating materials and symbols that connected them to their lineage and community. Marriage clothing often combined elements from both partners' traditions, creating new garments that symbolize the union of two individuals and often two families or clans. Death clothing prepared the deceased for their journey to the afterlife, with specific garments believed necessary for navigating the spiritual realm. These transitional garments were often preserved and passed down through generations, becoming repositories of family history and cultural memory. The creation of such garments might involve entire communities, with different individuals contributing materials, labor, or expertise. The influence of celestial observations on clothing production and decoration connected primitive peoples to cosmic cycles and seasonal rhythms. The timing of certain clothing-related activities might be determined by lunar phases, with dyeing or weaving begun at specific times believed to be most auspicious. Celestial motifs such as stars, moons, and suns appeared frequently in clothing decoration, sometimes as simple ornamental elements, but often carrying deeper meanings about the wearer's connection to cosmic forces. Some cultures believe that garments created or worn during certain astronomical events would gain special properties. The relationship between clothing and celestial cycles extended to practical matters as well, with the observation of stars and seasonal markers indicating when to prepare winter clothing or when certain materials would be available for harvest. The biodegradability of primitive clothing materials meant that garments eventually returned to the earth, completing a cycle that connected human culture with natural processes. Unlike modern synthetic materials, everything used in primitive clothing would eventually decompose, leaving little trace of individual garments, but sometimes preserving the tools and ornaments that were more durable. This impermanence influenced how primitive peoples thought about clothing, with an understanding that garments were temporary interventions in natural materials rather than permanent objects. The disposal of worn-out clothing might involve specific practices, from burning to burial to simply allowing garments to decompose naturally. Some cultures believed that the spirits of garments needed to be properly released, conducting ceremonies to thank clothes for their service before disposing of them. The adaptation of clothing for pregnancy and child-rearing showed remarkable innovation in addressing the changing needs of women's bodies and the practical requirements of caring for infants. Garments that could expand to accommodate growing bellies, openings that allowed for nursing, carriers that distributed infant weight comfortably while keeping hands free for work, all demonstrated sophisticated understanding of ergonomics and practical design. The creation of these specialized garments often involved knowledge passed down through female lines, with experienced mothers teaching younger women not just how to make these clothes, but when and how to modify them as needs changed. The decoration of pregnancy and infant clothing often incorporated protective symbols or materials, believed to ensure healthy pregnancies and strong children. The ventilation strategies employed in primitive clothing showed sophisticated understanding of airflow and heat management. Strategic placement of openings, the use of loosely woven sections for breathability, designs that created chimney effects drawing hot air up and out while allowing cool air to enter from below, all demonstrated practical engineering skills. These ventilation systems were often invisible when garments were at rest, but activated by movement, allowing wearers to regulate their temperature through activity level. Different cultures developed different solutions to the ventilation challenge, from the simple but effective gap-front robes that could be adjusted for temperature, to complex layered systems with multiple ventilation options. The knowledge of how to properly ventilate clothing while maintaining protection from elements required careful observation and experimentation over generations. The preservation of textile knowledge through oral traditions, physical examples, and hands-on teaching created robust systems for maintaining and transmitting clothing-related skills. Stories and songs contained information about materials, techniques, and seasonal timing embedded in narrative structures that made them easier to remember. Sample pieces showing different stitches, weaves, or construction methods served as three-dimensional textbooks that could be studied and copied. The apprenticeship systems that developed around clothing production ensured that skills were passed on with the nuanced understanding that comes from extended practice under guidance. This multimodal approach to knowledge preservation meant that even if one method of transmission was disrupted, others could maintain the continuity of tradition. The relationship between clothing and social bonding extended beyond the wearing of similar garments to include the communal activities involved in clothing production. Groups of people working together to process fibers, spin thread, weave cloth, or decorate garments created opportunities for conversation, storytelling, and relationship building. These communal work sessions were often accompanied by singing, with work songs that helped coordinate activities while making the labor more enjoyable. The shared effort of creating clothing strengthened social bonds and created networks of reciprocal obligation, with people helping each other with large projects, knowing they would receive help in return when needed. These social aspects of clothing production were as important as the practical outcomes, creating and reinforcing the social fabric that held communities together. The innovation cycles in primitive clothing showed patterns of gradual refinement, punctuated by occasional revolutionary changes. Most innovations were small improvements on existing techniques or designs, tested carefully and adopted slowly if proven successful. Occasionally, however, new materials, tools, or techniques would transform clothing production, spreading rapidly once their advantages were recognized. These revolutionary changes often came from cultural contact, environmental pressures, or singular innovative individuals who saw new possibilities in familiar materials. The adoption of innovations wasn't automatic, but required social acceptance, practical demonstration, and often modification to fit local needs and preferences. The tension between tradition and innovation in clothing created dynamic systems that could maintain cultural continuity while adapting to changing circumstances. The energy investment required for clothing production in primitive societies was enormous when calculated in terms of human labor hours. From the gathering or hunting of raw materials through all the processing steps to the final decoration of garments, each piece of clothing represented days, weeks, or even months of work. This investment made clothing valuable in ways that are difficult for modern people to fully appreciate. The loss or destruction of clothing was a serious matter, not easily remedied by simply making or acquiring new garments. This value influenced many aspects of social life, from the careful maintenance and repair of clothing to the use of garments as wealth storage and inheritance. The labor invested in clothing also created emotional connections between makers and garments, with pieces sometimes being kept long after they were wearable because of the memories and effort they embodied. The flexibility of primitive clothing designs often allowed single garments to serve multiple purposes, maximizing the utility of each piece. A large rectangular cloth might serve as a wrap skirt, a carrying cloth for babies or goods, a blanket for sleeping, or a shelter from sun or rain, depending on immediate needs. This multi-purpose approach to clothing reflected both practical constraints and sophisticated understanding of how simple forms could be adapted to various uses. The knowledge of how to properly fold, wrap, tie, or pin garments for different purposes was essential practical education, often begun in childhood through observation and practice. The versatility of these simple garments contrasted with more specialized clothing that could only serve specific purposes, and different cultures found different balance points between versatility and specialization based on their particular needs and resources. The weatherproofing techniques developed by primitive peoples went beyond simple water resistance to include protection from wind, sun, and temperature extremes. The application of various substances to clothing surfaces, from beeswax to plant resins to animal fats, created barriers that could repel water while still allowing some breathability. The understanding that different treatments worked better for different materials and conditions led to sophisticated systems of seasonal clothing preparation. Some treatments needed to be renewed regularly, while others were more permanent, and knowing when and how to reapply protective coatings was crucial for maintaining clothing functionality. The development of these weatherproofing techniques often involved careful observation of natural phenomena, such as how certain plants shed water or how animal fur maintained its protective properties. The color symbolism in primitive clothing extended beyond simple associations to create complex visual languages that could communicate subtle messages. The combination of colors, their placement on garments, and their relationship to the wearer's other visual elements created meanings that could be read by those who understood the cultural codes. A particular shade of red might indicate a woman was married, but combined with certain patterns or worn with specific accessories, it could provide information about how many children she had, her clan affiliation, or her ritual status. These color languages weren't static but evolved over time, with new meanings being added and old ones being modified or abandoned. The ability to correctly interpret and use color symbolism was a mark of cultural literacy, distinguishing insiders from outsiders and enabling complex nonverbal communication within communities. The ergonomic considerations in primitive clothing design showed remarkable attention to human movement and comfort. Garments were constructed with gussets and panels that allowed for full range of motion, with seams placed to avoid chafing during repetitive activities, with weight distributed to prevent strain on any single point. The positioning of closures where they could be easily reached, the use of adjustable elements to accommodate changes in body size or layering needs, the incorporation of padding or reinforcement where bodies contacted tools or surfaces, all demonstrated careful observation of how bodies moved and worked. These ergonomic features weren't always obvious, but became apparent through use, with well-designed garments feeling natural and unrestrictive, while poorly designed ones caused discomfort or limited movement. The acoustic properties of different materials influenced their use in both everyday and ceremonial clothing. Soft materials that absorbed sound might be preferred for hunting garments, while materials that created pleasing sounds when moved might be chosen for dance or celebration clothing. The understanding that wet materials often had different acoustic properties than dry ones influenced how garments were prepared for different uses. Some cultures developed specific techniques for treating materials to enhance or diminish their sound-producing qualities, such as starching fabrics to make them rustle more or oiling leather to make it move more quietly. This attention to the sonic dimension of clothing reflected a more general awareness of how all aspects of material culture contributed to the sensory environment of daily life. The repair techniques developed for different types of damage showed sophisticated understanding of material properties and structural forces. A tear in woven fabric required different repair methods than a tear in leather, and repairs needed to restore not just coverage, but also strength and flexibility. The development of invisible mending techniques that could make repairs nearly undetectable demonstrated high levels of skill and patience. Some repairs were intentionally visible, creating decorative elements from necessity or marking garments with their history of use and care. The tools and materials kept specifically for clothing repair were often carried by travelers and might include various types of thread, needles, patches, and adhesives. The ability to perform field repairs on clothing was essential survival knowledge, particularly for people who spent extended periods away from settlement resources. The social regulations around clothing often extended to specific rules about who could make certain garments, not just who could wear them. Some types of clothing might only be made by people who had undergone specific initiations or training, with unauthorized production being seen as a serious transgression. The knowledge required to make certain ceremonial or high-status garments might be restricted to particular families or guilds, creating specialized occupational groups with carefully guarded trade secrets. These restrictions served multiple purposes, from maintaining quality standards to preserving social hierarchies to ensuring that spiritually significant garments were properly made with the appropriate rituals and intentions. The enforcement of these regulations varied from social pressure to formal sanctions, with violations potentially resulting in exclusion from community activities or worse. The relationship between clothing and personal identity was so strong in many primitive societies that garments became extensions of the self, imbued with the essence of their wearers. Clothing worn during significant life events might be carefully preserved as tangible connections to those experiences. The exchange of garments between individuals could create or strengthen personal bonds, with the clothing carrying something of its original owner to its new wearer. This understanding of clothing as more than mere material objects influenced how garments were treated, stored, and eventually disposed of. Some cultures believed that clothing retained connections to their wearers even after being discarded, leading to specific practices around the disposal of personal garments to prevent them from being used for harmful magic or spiritual manipulation. The seasonal migration patterns of many primitive peoples required clothing systems that could adapt to changing environments encountered during travels. Garments needed to function in the starting location, during the journey, and at the destination, often encountering significantly different conditions along the way. This requirement led to the development of highly adaptable clothing systems, with garments that could be easily modified, layered, or reconfigured as needed. The packing and transportation of clothing during migrations required careful planning, with decisions about what to carry based on weight, bulk, and anticipated needs. The knowledge of what clothing would be needed at different points in migration routes was passed down through generations, with stories and songs helping people remember the relationship between landmarks and clothing requirements. The integration of found objects into clothing decoration showed creative resourcefulness and openness to incorporating new materials. Trade beads, metal objects, unusual stones, shells from distant shores, all might find their way onto garments as decorative elements. The incorporation of these objects wasn't random, but followed aesthetic principles and symbolic systems that gave meaning to their placement and use. Some objects might be believed to carry special properties or connections to distant places and peoples. The adaptation of non-traditional materials into traditional clothing styles created hybrid forms that reflected cultural contact and exchange while maintaining distinctive local identities. This willingness to incorporate new elements while maintaining traditional forms showed the dynamic nature of primitive clothing traditions. The thermal mass properties of certain clothing materials were understood and utilized even without formal knowledge of physics. Heavy garments that absorbed heat during the day and released it slowly at night. Materials that provided insulation when dry, but lost heat rapidly when wet. The different thermal properties of various furs and fibers. All were known through experience and incorporated into clothing choices. The use of dark colors to absorb heat and light colors to reflect it. The understanding that shiny surfaces behave differently than matte ones. The knowledge that certain weaves or knits created better insulation than others. All demonstrated practical physics knowledge gained through observation and experience. This understanding influenced not just material selection, but also when and how different garments were worn to maximize comfort and protection. The development of specialized clothing for water activities showed innovation in addressing the unique challenges of aquatic environments. Garments that wouldn't become waterlogged and heavy. Materials that maintained some insulation even when wet. Designs that didn't restrict swimming movements. All required different approaches than land-based clothing. Some cultures developed primitive wetsuits from animal bladders or intestines, creating garments that trapped a layer of water next to the skin that would warm up and provide insulation. Others focused on clothing that could be quickly removed before entering water and quickly dried after emerging. The decoration and symbolic elements of water-related clothing often reflected beliefs about water spirits, the dangers of aquatic environments, and the relationship between human and aquatic worlds. The influence of warfare on clothing development led to innovations that balanced protection with mobility. While full armor was rare in most primitive societies, various forms of reinforced clothing provided some protection against weapons, while still allowing warriors to move effectively. Thick leather garments, clothing reinforced with bone or wooden plates, padded garments that could absorb impact, all represented attempts to improve warrior survivability without sacrificing fighting effectiveness. The psychological aspects of war clothing were as important as the physical protection, with fearsome decorations, faces painted on clothing, or the incorporation of enemy trophies serving to intimidate opponents and boost warrior confidence. The creation of war clothing often involved special rituals and preparations believed to imbue garments with protective or strength-giving properties. The role of children in clothing production varied between cultures, but often provided important learning opportunities and labor contributions. Young children might begin by helping with simple tasks like sorting materials or holding things while adults worked. As they grew, they would take on more complex tasks, gradually learning all aspects of clothing production through observation and practice. The clothing-related toys and practice materials given to children help them develop necessary motor skills and knowledge while contributing to household production, even in their play. The progression from childhood helper to adult producer was often marked by specific milestones, such as creating their first complete garment or being trusted with valuable materials. This integrated approach to education ensured that clothing knowledge was transmitted effectively while also utilizing all available labor resources. The preservation of wedding garments and other ceremonial clothing created material archives of family and cultural history. These garments were often stored with special care, brought out for display during certain occasions, and sometimes modified for use by successive generations. The stories associated with these garments, who wore them and when, what events they witnessed, became part of family lore passed down alongside the physical objects. The decision about who would inherit ceremonial garments could be significant, marking chosen successors or favorite relatives. The modification of inherited ceremonial garments to fit new wearers required skill to maintain the garment's essential character, while adapting it to different body sizes or contemporary styles. These heirloom garments served as tangible connections to ancestors and cultural continuity across generations. The development of closure systems for clothing showed remarkable innovation given the limited materials available. Before the invention of buttons and zippers, primitive peoples developed various methods for keeping clothing closed and properly positioned on the body. Toggles and loops, pins made from bone or thorns, tied closures using various knotting techniques, wrapped and tucked arrangements that held through tension, all provided solutions to the closure challenge. The placement of closures needed to consider not just function, but also ease of use, with closures needing to be reachable and operable by the wearer. Some closure systems were designed to be adjustable, allowing garments to accommodate different body sizes or wearing styles. The decoration of closures often made them focal points of garments, with elaborate pins, decorated toggles, or complex knotwork serving both functional and aesthetic purposes. The influence of animal behavior on clothing design extended beyond simple mimicry to sophisticated applications of observed principles. Watching how animals stayed warm, cool, or dry provided insights that could be applied to human clothing. The way fur arranged itself on different parts of animals' bodies suggested optimal placement of fur on garments. The observation that many animals had different coat weights for different seasons inspired the creation of seasonal clothing systems. The water-shedding properties of bird feathers led to their incorporation into rain-resistant garments. Some cultures believed that wearing clothing made from certain animals would convey that animal's qualities to the wearer, leading to specific choices based on desired attributes like strength, speed, or stealth. This bio-inspired approach to clothing design showed sophisticated observation skills and ability to translate natural principles into cultural applications. The treatment of clothing as wealth and currency in some primitive societies created economic systems based on textile production and exchange. High-quality garments or rare materials might serve as standardized units of value, with specific types of cloth or garments being accepted as payment for goods and services. The accumulation of fine clothing represented not just personal wealth, but also social capital that could be deployed through gift-giving or display. The knowledge of textile values, quality markers, and authentication methods became important for anyone engaged in trade. The storage and protection of textile wealth required special consideration, with valuable garments being protected from damage while still being occasionally displayed to maintain their social value. The inheritance of textile wealth could significantly impact individual and family fortunes, making clothing production and accumulation important economic strategies. The relationship between clothing and dance or performance arts created specialized garments designed to enhance movement and visual impact. The weight and drape of materials influenced how they moved during dance, with heavier materials creating different visual effects than lighter ones. The attachment of movement-responsive decorations like fringes, feathers, or suspended ornaments created secondary movements that amplified and extended the dancer's motions. The construction of dance garments needed to accommodate extreme movements without tearing or shifting inappropriately. Some dance garments were designed to transform during performance, with layers that could be removed or elements that could be revealed through movement. The creation of these performance garments required not just craft skills, but also understanding of how materials behaved in motion and how visual effects would appear to audiences. The use of clothing in healing and medical practices extended beyond simple bandaging to include garments believed to have therapeutic properties. Certain materials might be worn against the skin to treat specific ailments, with beliefs about the transfer of properties from materials to wearers. Colored garments might be prescribed for different conditions, with color therapy being practiced through clothing choices. The compression provided by tightly wrapped garments could address swelling or support injured limbs. Some healing garments incorporated medicinal plants or substances, creating primitive forms of transdermal delivery systems. The creation of medical clothing required knowledge that bridged practical understanding of body, mechanics, and traditional beliefs about health and healing. The wearing of protective clothing during epidemics or when caring for the sick showed understanding of disease transmission, even without formal germ theory. The adaptation of clothing for different life stages showed sophisticated understanding of changing body needs and social roles. Infant clothing prioritized ease of cleaning and access for caregiving while providing appropriate warmth and protection. Children's clothing balanced durability for active play with ability to accommodate rapid growth. Adult clothing reflected occupational needs and social status while maintaining practical functionality. Elder clothing might prioritize ease of dressing and comfort over display, with modifications to accommodate reduced mobility or other age-related changes. The transition between life-stage clothing categories was often marked by ceremonies or gradually achieved through incremental changes. The knowledge of how to appropriately dress for one's life stage was part of social education, with violations of age-appropriate dress sometimes seen as serious breaches of social norms. The influence of topography and local geography on clothing styles created regional variations that reflected environmental adaptations. Mountain peoples developed clothing suited for steep terrain and altitude changes, with non-slip footwear and layering systems for rapid temperature variations. Coastal peoples created clothing that could withstand salt exposure and provided protection from reflected sun and water. Forest dwellers developed clothing that protected from thorns and insects while allowing movement through dense vegetation. Desert peoples created clothing that protected from sun and sand while maximizing cooling through ventilation. These geographic adaptations weren't just practical but became part of regional identities, with clothing styles serving as markers of origin and environmental expertise. The role of smell in primitive clothing went beyond simple cleanliness to include intentional scenting for various purposes. Garments might be smoked to impart pleasant aromas and pest-repelling properties. Aromatic plants might be stored with clothing or incorporated into garments through sachets or direct application. The scents associated with different activities, from the smoke of cooking fires to the oils used in leatherworking, became embedded in clothing and served as olfactory markers of occupation or status. Some cultures developed sophisticated perfuming techniques for clothing, with specific scents being associated with different social occasions or personal states. The management of clothing odors, both preventing unpleasant smells and creating pleasant ones, required knowledge of various natural substances and their properties. The mathematical ratios and proportions found in primitive clothing construction revealed intuitive understanding of geometric principles. The golden ratio appeared in the proportions of many garments, creating visually pleasing forms that cultures worldwide independently discovered. The use of modular units based on body measurement created sizing systems that could be scaled up or down while maintaining proper proportions. The geometric patterns used in decoration often showed sophisticated understanding of symmetry, tessellation, and transformation. The ability to visualize and execute these mathematical relationships without formal mathematical training demonstrated the human capacity for intuitive mathematical reasoning. These mathematical principles weren't consciously applied in most cases, but emerged from aesthetic preferences and practical experiences that favored certain proportions and relationships. The development of protective clothing for specific environmental hazards showed problem-solving skills and risk management strategies. Clothing that protected from thorns and cutting grasses, garments that prevented insect bites, coverage that reduced exposure to poisonous plants, all demonstrated understanding of environmental dangers and how to mitigate them through clothing. The creation of these protective garments often required trade-offs between protection and other desired qualities like breathability or flexibility. Some protective clothing was designed for temporary use during specific dangerous activities, while other garments provided ongoing protection during daily life. The knowledge of which hazards required which types of protection was essential survival information, passed down through generations along with stories of what happened to those who failed to properly protect themselves. The social significance of clothing gifts in maintaining relationships in hierarchies created complex systems of textile circulation within and between communities. The giving of clothing at births, marriages, deaths, and other significant events created networks of obligation and reciprocity that structured social life. The quality and appropriateness of clothing gifts reflected and influenced relationships between givers and receivers. The refusal or return of clothing gifts could signal relationship problems or social conflicts. The display of received garments honored the givers and maintained social bonds across distance and time. The knowledge of appropriate clothing gifts for different occasions and relationships was part of social education, with mistakes potentially causing serious offense or misunderstanding. The circulation of clothing through gift networks meant that individual garments might have complex histories, having passed through multiple owners and accumulated layers of meaning and connection. The influence of mythology and cosmology on clothing design connected garments to larger belief systems and worldviews. Creation stories might describe the first clothing and provide templates for contemporary garments. Mythological beings might be depicted in clothing that influenced human fashion. Cosmological beliefs about the structure of the universe might be reflected in the organization of decorative elements on garments. The recreation of mythological clothing for ceremonies allowed humans to temporarily embody divine or heroic figures. The rules and taboos surrounding certain clothing often had mythological justifications that explained why things must be done certain ways. This integration of clothing into religious and philosophical systems meant that garments weren't just practical or social objects, but also spiritual and cosmological ones, connecting wearers to larger realms of meaning and power. The development of size standardization systems in primitive clothing production facilitated trade and gift exchange while maintaining allowances for individual variation. While not as precise as modern sizing, various cultures developed ways to categorize garments by general size ranges, often using body landmarks or proportions as reference points. This standardization made it possible to create garments for unknown recipients, enabling longer distance trade and gift relationships. The methods for adjusting standard sizes to individual bodies through belting, pinning, or temporary alterations provided flexibility within standardized systems. The knowledge of how different populations tended to vary in body proportions influenced how garments were sized for different markets. The development of these sizing systems represented early attempts at mass production, though still within craft-based production methods. The pest management strategies for protecting clothing from insects, rodents, and other threats required extensive knowledge of natural repellents and prevention methods. Different plants were known to repel different pests, with some being sewn into garments or stored with them. The timing of when to air clothing, how to properly clean and dry garments before storage, and where to store different types of clothing all influenced pest damage. Some cultures developed elaborate storage systems with multiple barriers against pests, while others relied on regular inspection and maintenance to catch problems early. The loss of clothing to pests could be devastating given the investment required to create garments, making pest management a crucial skill for household management. The knowledge of which pests threatened which materials, and how to identify early signs of infestation was passed down through generations of careful observation and experience. The relationship between clothing and social mobility revealed both opportunities and constraints in primitive societies. Exceptional skill in clothing production could elevate individual social status, with master craftspeople gaining respect and economic advantages. The acquisition of high-status clothing through trade, gift, or production might enable individuals to participate in social circles otherwise closed to them. However, sumptuary rules in many societies limited what people of different ranks could wear, making clothing both a ladder and a barrier to social advancement. The ability to correctly navigate clothing-related social rules while pushing boundaries when possible required sophisticated social intelligence. The stories of individuals who rose or fell based on clothing-related successes or failures became part of cultural narratives about social possibility and limitation. The development of reversible and transformable garments showed innovation in maximizing clothing utility while minimizing possessions. Garments that could be worn inside out to show different colors or patterns, pieces that could be reconfigured into different styles, clothing with removable elements that changed its appearance or function, all demonstrated creative approaches to extending clothing possibilities. These transformable garments were particularly valuable for people with limited wardrobes or those who needed to travel light. The construction of reversible garments required careful attention to finishing techniques that would look good from either side. The knowledge of how to properly transform garments and when different configurations were appropriate added layers of complexity to clothing use. These multi-purpose garments challenged makers to think creatively about construction and challenged wearers to fully utilize their clothing's potential. The influence of dietary practices on clothing production might seem distant, but the relationship was significant in many primitive societies. The availability of hunting versus gathering activities influenced whether leather or plant-based clothing predominated. Societies with taboos against killing certain animals couldn't use their hides for clothing, requiring alternative materials. The seasonal availability of food influenced when people had time for clothing production, with intensive food gathering periods leaving little time for textile work. The preservation techniques used for food sometimes paralleled those used for clothing materials, with similar principles applied to preventing decay. The nutritional status of populations affected their ability to produce clothing, with well-fed people having more energy for the intensive labor required. The trade relationships that developed around food often paralleled or integrated with those around clothing, with the same merchants dealing in both necessities. The acoustic landscape created by community clothing production activities contributed to the sonic environment of primitive societies. The rhythmic beating of bark cloth production, the whoosh of spinning wheels, the clack of looms, the conversations and songs that accompanied group textile work, all created distinctive soundscapes that marked time and activity. These sounds served practical purposes, helping coordinate group activities and alerting others to ongoing work, but they also had social and cultural significance. The ability to recognize different textile production sounds and understand what they indicated about community activities was part of environmental awareness. The absence of these familiar sounds might signal problems or changes in community life. The incorporation of textile production sounds into music and storytelling helped preserve and transmit the rhythms and patterns of work across generations, embedding practical knowledge and cultural expression. The role of clothing in conflict resolution and peacemaking demonstrated its significance beyond mere covering or decoration. The exchange of garments between former enemies could seal peace agreements, with the clothing serving as tangible reminders of commitments made. The wearing of specific clothing during negotiations might signal intentions and set tones for discussions. Garments could serve as compensation for wrongs, with their value helping restore balance after conflicts. The public removal or tearing of clothing might dramatically mark the end of hostilities or the breaking of relationships. The creation of special peace garments that incorporated elements from different groups could symbolize unity and shared identity. The protocols around clothing during conflict resolution were often highly formalized, with specific requirements about what should be worn, exchanged, or destroyed at different stages of the process. The development of camouflage and disguise clothing showed sophisticated understanding of visual perception and environmental blending. Beyond simple color matching, primitive peoples developed techniques for breaking up human outlines, creating textures that mimic natural surfaces, and incorporating actual environmental materials into garments for maximum concealment. Different types of camouflage were developed for different purposes, from hunting to warfare to spiritual ceremonies, where becoming invisible or unrecognizable was desired. The creation of effective camouflage required not just understanding of materials and colors, but also knowledge of how light and shadow played across surfaces, how movement revealed presence, and how different viewing distances affected visibility. The teaching of camouflage techniques often involved careful observation, exercises, and practical training in various environments. The relationship between clothing and time marking extended beyond seasonal changes to include daily and ceremonial time structures. Different garments might be worn at different times of day, with morning clothing differing from afternoon or evening wear, even within the same activity categories. Ceremonial clothing marked special times in ritual calendars, with specific garments being brought out only for particular celebrations or observances. The wear patterns on clothing could serve as temporal markers, showing how long garments had been in use and sometimes indicating their ritual or social age rather than mere physical age. The preparation of clothing for time-specific uses, such as the annual waterproofing of winter garments or the refreshing of ceremonial clothing before important festivals, created rhythms of activity that structured community life. Knowledge of when different clothing was appropriate required understanding of both practical and cultural time systems. The influence of color availability on social and cultural development went beyond mere aesthetic choices to shape fundamental aspects of society. Regions with access to diverse dye sources developed more complex color coding systems and color-based social distinctions. The rarity or difficulty of producing certain colors gave them special significance and power. The seasonal availability of dye materials created temporal patterns in clothing production and influenced when certain colors could be worn. The trade in rare dyes and colored textiles created economic relationships that could span continents. Technical knowledge required to produce and fix certain colors created specialized occupational groups with carefully guarded secrets. The symbolic associations of colors, developing from their natural sources and production processes, influenced religious, political, and social systems in profound ways. The biomechanics of carrying loads influenced clothing design in ways that balanced functionality with cultural preferences. Garments designed to distribute weight across the body, pockets and pouches positioned for balance and accessibility, reinforced areas where carrying straps or loads would rest, all showed understanding of how to minimize strain and maximize carrying capacity. Different cultures developed different carrying solutions based on their typical loads and activities, from tumblines that distributed weight across the forehead to complex harness systems that spread loads across shoulders and hips. Integration of carrying capacity into everyday clothing meant that people were always prepared to transport goods as opportunities arose. The knowledge of how to properly load and balance carried items was taught from childhood, with games and exercises helping develop the strength and skills needed for adult carrying tasks. The relationship between clothing and architecture showed parallel developments in creating protective environments for human bodies. The same principles that guided clothing construction often appeared in shelter building, with layering for insulation, ventilation for climate control, and waterproofing for weather protection. Mobile peoples often used the same materials for both clothing and shelter, with large garments sometimes serving as temporary shelters and shelter materials being repurposed into clothing. The skills required for creating clothing and creating shelters overlapped significantly, with expertise in one area often translating to competence in the other. The seasonal transitions between emphasizing clothing versus shelter for protection reflected sophisticated strategies for managing comfort and resources. Decorative traditions that developed in clothing often paralleled those in architecture, with similar patterns, colors, and symbolic elements appearing in both domains. The development of occupational clothing for specialized tasks showed how garments evolved to meet specific functional requirements while maintaining cultural identity. Blacksmiths developed leather aprons and protective garments that could withstand sparks and heat. Potters wore clothing that could be easily cleaned of clay and wouldn't interfere with wheelwork. Farmers developed garments that protected from sun and allowed freedom of movement for repetitive tasks. Fishers created clothing that could withstand constant moisture and salt exposure. These occupational garments often became identity markers, allowing people to be recognized by their clothing even when not engaged in their work. The knowledge embedded in occupational clothing design represented generations of problem solving and refinement, with small improvements accumulating over time to create highly optimized garments. The role of clothing in storytelling and oral tradition extended beyond mere description to include physical demonstrations and tactile experiences. Storytellers might use actual garments or clothing elements as props, allowing audiences to see and touch materials mentioned in tales. The creation of special storytelling garments that incorporated visual elements from narratives helped audiences follow complex stories. The creation of special storytelling garments that incorporated visual elements from narratives helped audiences follow complex stories. Wearing of ancestral clothing during the telling of family histories created powerful connections between past and present. The sounds made by certain garments during dramatic gestures added acoustic dimensions to storytelling performances. The teaching of cultural narratives often included instruction about the clothing mentioned in stories, helping listeners understand not just what happened, but how people dressed and why it mattered. These multi-sensory storytelling experiences made narratives more memorable and impactful than words alone could achieve. Influence of pregnancy and fertility beliefs on clothing design created garments that were believed to promote or protect reproductive health. Specific colors, patterns, or materials might be worn to encourage conception, ensure healthy pregnancies, or ease childbirth. Protective symbols and amulets were incorporated into maternity clothing to guard against harm to mother and child. Loosening or removal of knots and bindings during labor reflected beliefs about sympathetic magic and the need to remove obstacles to birth. Postpartum clothing often included elements believed to help recovery and promote milk production. The sharing of successful pregnancy clothing between women created bonds and transmitted both practical garments and reassuring traditions. The knowledge of which clothing practices were associated with reproductive success was carefully preserved and shared among women, forming part of the essential wisdom passed between generations. The adaptation of clothing for night and sleep showed understanding of how body needs change during rest. Sleeping garments needed to maintain warmth without overheating, allow for movement during sleep, and be comfortable against the skin for extended periods. Some cultures developed elaborate nighttime clothing systems with multiple layers that could be adjusted as body temperature changed during the night. Others preferred minimal sleeping attire, relying on bedding rather than clothing for warmth. The beliefs about what should be worn during sleep often incorporated ideas about vulnerability during sleep and the need for spiritual protection. Special garments might be worn to promote good dreams or prevent night terrors. The transition from day to night clothing often involved rituals that marked the boundary between waking and sleeping life. The development of fastening systems that could be operated one-handed or by people with limited dexterity showed inclusive design thinking in primitive societies. Toggle closures that could be manipulated with cold or arthritic fingers, wrap designs that didn't require precise manipulation, magnetic or gravity-based closures using natural materials, all provided alternatives to complex tying or pinning systems. These accessible designs often benefited everyone, not just those with limitations, by making dressing easier and faster. The knowledge of how to modify standard garments for people with different physical abilities was part of community care practices. The creation of adaptive clothing that maintained dignity and cultural appropriateness while meeting special needs required creativity and empathy. The integration of accessible design elements into mainstream clothing showed that primitive societies valued inclusion and recognized diverse needs within their communities. The relationship between clothing and music extended beyond the sounds made by garments to include the coordination of textile production. With musical rhythms, work songs helped coordinate group activities like beating bark cloth or working looms, with the rhythm helping maintain consistent motion and making repetitive tasks less tedious. The patterns created in textiles often reflected musical structures, with visual rhythms that paralleled acoustic ones. Some cultures developed notation systems where textile patterns could represent melodies or rhythms, creating wearable music that could be read by those who understood the system. The decoration of musical instruments with textile elements and the decoration of clothing with musical instruments created reciprocal relationships between these art forms.